have Gray talking about.
All that should be said.
All right, he'll introduce it.
So this is going to be a relatively more philosophical talk, but I presume y'all will enjoy it and find value in it. I'm going to talk about internalizing simulated systems. And I'm going to spell everything out. So the medium that I think is quite open-ended and unexplored as of yet is VR and the production of rendered surroundings.
Are we recording this, by the way?
Yeah.
Great.
And I'm going to talk about a few ways of gathering sensory input that are relatively unexplored as well. And I'm hoping that the unification of those two things may provide a quite novel way of experiencing complex systems. The cool thing about VR and simulated realities is that they're unconstrained by physics. They can literally, you can instantiate really any coherent system, or incoherent if need be, but they're not constrained by physical laws, and so you can end up having arrangements of systems that are physically impossible and yet still like coherent and manipulable and so on. And those are pretty cool in a lot of ways. I'm gonna talk, so like this talk is a little modular in some ways, and so there's not like a specific linear through line. So I'm going to sort of like toss up different balls together, and then together they'll sort of like form a shape in the air, and then they'll kind of point at the same thing. So I'll talk a little about neuroplasticity. There's been a whole bunch of different experiments about providing the body senses outside of the normal range and having the brain internalize that. For example, there's one of the first ones that I learned about was David Eagleman's neosensory vest. It's this. I've brought up a few of these examples just in conversation, but I'll bring them up again to really formally talk about them. It has about 40 or 50 different vibrating motors spread out over the course of the torso, and they're worn by deaf people, and the sound waves are encoded into their vibrations in a way that's comparable to how the human cochlea chunks out the frequency spectrum. As the cochlea spirals inward, different frequencies get lost because they can't propagate as far into the middle, and so the sensor hairs at different points in the cochlea are receiving a different chunking of the frequency spectrum, and so that's what the audio cortex actually takes in, is like this like parallelized chunking of the frequency spectrum. And so David Eagleman has taken a microphone and connected that and had those motors be vibrating in correspondence to a specific chunk of the frequency spectrum. Deaf people have been given this to wear and just like walk around and like experience the world like normal, but feeling these tactile sensations on the vest that correspond to the sound around them. And they'll wear it for like a week or two, and they'll initially just feel the tactile sensations, but over the course of time, the brain starts to correlate like specific things seen in vision and felt and the sensations there, and it stops being tactile sensation. It becomes literal audio perception. It becomes direct hearing again. And these people subjectively experience hearing in the same way that they did it before, and they're not really concerned about the tactile sensation on their chest anymore, because their brain is just like taken the same data and internalized it, and it becomes raw perception again.
So do you know anything about how this is experienced by people who are congenitally deaf?
I think the experiments that have just been done with people who have lost hearing, I wouldn't be surprised if a similar experience would be possible, if not a little longer. I think that the fact that people had already been hearingful and had lost it meant that the audio cortex was still developed in some way, and it probably atrophied during the period of their deafness, only to be kind of re-enlivened when the newly available sensory sources becomes present. But I feel like people who are congenitally deaf, their audio cortex might have been like totally atrophied from the beginning, and I think that it's quite possible that they could have gained that entirely new sense. I'm not sure that the research has covered that yet, but I would not be surprised if that was possible. In a lot of these, I think I'm just trying to point at how the brain if given enough time, can take coherent data, and if it's correlatable with other sensory sources, can turn it into direct perception. Another one is the Brainport electrotactile array. It's like a little grid, maybe 100 by 100, like grid of like electro things that are correspond to the output from an IR camera, and so they just change their amplitude in grayscale. And you can place it on your tongue, and like you could move an object in front of the camera, and you can sort of feel it on your tongue, and the same thing happens. Like if you wear it for like enough time, you stop directly feeling it on your tongue, and it becomes literal visual perception. And this can happen for people who are already sighted too, but then you can just extend their sight into the infrared or whatever sensory chunk that the camera is focusing on. And
wait, so what are you putting in your mouth?
a little flat, like tab that's connected to a wire to the camera, and so that electrode array is just like changing in amplitude, and you feel like it'll.
You have your eyes closed or something?
You can have your eyes closed and be like walking around with the camera, and I think you can also have your eyes open and still be getting just more data about the electromagnetic spectrum than what your eyes can normally keep track of. Basically, what I'm trying to say is like the body happens to be born with a certain set of like physiologies or a certain like set of sensory organs. Like we're sensitive to the electromagnetic spectrum in this particular chunk. We're sensitive to the vibrations in the fluid medium that we're immersed in. We're sensitive to like direct like contact with matter, and we're sensitive to like the positionings of our bodies in space just by like feeling the different states of our muscles and stuff. And what I'm saying is like the brain receives those things as sensory input because we just happen to be provided those by our physiology, and it's the case that we can give ourselves coherent data, and that can become sensory perception as well outside of what's rawly available in our bodies. Another example is I don't remember the person who did this. Oh, Stratton. I don't remember his first name. I didn't write it down. He built this set of goggles that he had grad students wear, which perfectly inverted the sight. And so like on their retinas, up light was hitting the top of their retinas and down light was hitting the bottom of their retinas, which is not how it is currently. And it took about a week or two, and people's vision totally flipped again. So they would be wearing the goggles and they'd still be seeing things right side up. And they'd take off the goggles and everything would be inverted for them again. And it took their brain another period of time to like re-flip again.
This on grad students?
Yeah. Or like grad students are just like, yeah, I'm getting paid, I'll do it. And then, but in that case, we're able to see that like the brain is still getting like the same set of information. It just has to treat it a different way, and then it can turn back into normalized perception. I think the most important part of that is the fact that this arbitrary sensory source that you're providing is correlatable with other senses. Like it'd be very different if you were just getting like a webcam feed of somewhere totally else, because that's like the only source of that, and it's a very different thing when I like hit this. I see it being hit. I hear it. I feel it in terms of like the sensation on my skin. I feel it in terms of like not being able to move my arm forward, and all of those things are like simultaneously like communicating the unification of that event. Whereas if you were just getting like raw stock market data as you were going through your day, there's really no action in your other field of senses that would correlate to any change in the stock market. And so I'm not sure that you'd be able. I feel like a big point is that the brain's able to find pattern because it's able to like see like specific moments that are like unique across them, that are like coherent in time and like very specified. So I think that's a really big part, and that's the good part about VR, because VR can provide us a lot of these same sensory inputs. So how many of y'all have experienced VR like with hand tracking in 3D space, and you can go around and move? I know you have. Have you, Mason? Okay. So VR goggles show you two stereo RGB screens, one per eye. So you can get identical depth perception just from like the difference in spacing of objects. Your brain can work out through 3D space. So you can be on top of a skyscraper and look down and get vertigo. It's tracking your head not only its orientation, but also its position in space. So you can have rendered objects, and you can go up and like look at them really close, and this entire like point of view in the optical field is like being kept track of. So everything is like held like coherent. So objects still like have a presence. Like people, if they're just like walking in a rendered environment, they'll naturally avoid rendered objects that show like chairs and stuff, because like they're just as real for the body in terms of like occupying a physical space that like, even though you could literally just walk straight through it and you would phase directly through it because there's nothing actually impeding you in matter. The cool part about VR to me is especially the manipulation with hands, because the hands are the way that we interface with the world for the most part. They allow us to just like pick up something in 3D space, orient it arbitrarily within the radius of our arms, and that's a very, very powerful thing, especially as we're coming to get to understand the dynamics of tools. And that's a big part of this for me. I'm thinking of an example like, have y'all all driven a manual transmission car?
Badly, almost a couple in a parking lot.
Yeah.
Okay. I think a lot of what I'm saying will also work with the automatic as well. But there's basically like, especially as you first start driving, you're thinking very, very consciously about all your actions, because you're not really used to the dynamics of the car, and but a lot of this stuff is new for you, and you don't know exactly like how much to depress any pedal at a given moment, or like how to turn. But after you drive for a long period of time, the car in some ways kind of becomes an extension of your body, where you're not thinking about manipulating these objects anymore, and you're just like doing driving. And I've definitely felt sensations where I might be like going into a turn, I'll like shift into neutral, I'll be like turning the wheel a certain amount, and I'm not even like consciously thinking about how much to turn. It's just like happening because I feel the rate of turning, and then I'll like know exactly when to start like re-engaging the clutch to shift into a new gear, and like all this is happening totally outside of like any conscious choice. It's just like part of like doing the car. Another example would be like when you write, like the crux of your attention is like at the point of the pencil. Like when you feel like the impact of the pencil on the paper, like you see the pencil tip go down and you feel that resistance, and like the crux of that is like happening for you at that tip, even though you're literally only feeling like lateral forces on your fingers. That's not what you're like focusing on. Like in some ways you've extended your body into the tip of the pencil, and that becomes like the edge of the tool of your body to do that manipulation. And I think that these situations where we're taking these inert, inanimate objects and in some ways internalizing their dynamics so that they can become an extension of our bodies allows us to manipulate the world in very much more finely grained ways than our like raw biological bodies can't provide.
I forget who said it, but they said that human beings are naturally born cyborgs. So we like actively seek these things out, like even over thousands of years, like with the development of tools and stuff like that. But also, you know, like just like bikes, for example. I mean, it's not like terribly old, but you know, when you're riding a bike, it really is an extension of your body. When you're skateboarding, it's an extension of your body. Like we, like as humans, like actively seek out like augmenting the body in ways in order to perform these tasks. And it seems like quite natural, and it goes back thousands of years. So
right, this is like embedded with us as a species in terms of like extending ourselves physically and intellectually. Mm-hmm. Another good example of that I think I mentioned earlier is the abacus. Like the abacus is an incredible calculating instrument. People can go very, very quickly with it, and like masters of the abacus have been able to internalize the structure and dynamics of the system involved, like and they can like remember the state of like the given arrangement of pegs really easily. And the cool part about this like tool is that it's a tool that you can have yourself in front of you physically and manipulate it and do the calculations and like have it just become like perfectly automatic in a lot of ways when you're like moving through these sequences of calculations. But the cool part is, since it's like a physical thing that you can manipulate in space, the brain is able to construct an internalized model of it, so that the like master abacus users don't need an abacus. They can do all the calculations in their head, because I think a strength of it is that like the physical manipulation part of it allows your brain to like build like an internalized, spatialized, manipulable model that can do the same operations. And it's like the progression of the tool has actually given you more than what the tool can actually provide in and of itself. It's like given you this secondary ability, and that's something that the calculator does the opposite of. Like a calculator, you just like press these buttons and you receive the output, but since it doesn't require the same like set of calculations and manipulations, and so like your calculating ability atrophies when you rely upon the calculator too much, because you're just receiving the answer without really putting in the effort or the like operations involved with actually coming to the answer. And so I'm trying to get at these mental tools, or like the ability of tools to in some ways create a mental version of themselves. So I'll kind of combine what I was saying with the neuroplasticity and like those like the arbitrary sensor providing networks. Network is not the word I was thinking of. Like the vest and stuff with VR. So let's say that you're like simulating a system in VR. Like you're simulating a quantum system, and some like aspect of its operation. If y'all have any like good examples for what might be good to simulate, I'm happy to hear it. But if you have some system that you're like simulating it through time or whatever, there are states of it that you can attempt to depict visually. Obviously, it's impossible to depict 100% of the system visually in some sort of like expanded mode. There's just like too much going on for it to kind of be constrained into only like a three-dimensional representation. But that's one part. We can get some vision. We can encode some aspects of its behavior in sound as well. And I think we can take other aspects of its behavior that aren't possibly that analogous to anything in vision or in sound, and we can provide that to the body just as raw data, not in any sort of way where we're attempting to mediate it through the senses that we're normally used to. Like if we just like to take some like, I'm gonna expose my my lack of knowledge in a lot of these affairs. You could just like take the spin state of some like collection of particles and then like provide that to the body. And if you are with this system in some way that it can be perturbed by like your physical action, and you can go in and like relate like visual aspects of the visual representation of it and any like proprioceptive effects that you can like stimulate it with if you like attach your physical motion to some effect of the system that you're able to simulate rather, and it's able to provide its internal state to this this sensor affair. I posit that if you're given enough time to like work with the system and kind of like feel out its dynamics, you can literally internalize its internal state in a way which becomes sensory perception for you, and not just like feeling the tactile things, like in an analogous way to how people ended up being able to hear directly without only being aware of like the mediation, like the raw mediation.
That seems difficult to do if we don't actually know how the system works.
Right.
Because then
It's going to be limited by models. It gives you this type of sensory perception for models, like as defined, because then you would let the simulation evolve in the VR environment,
right.
and the simulation would be confined to the strength of our models.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and so in some ways this is an attempt to like test our models or like understand the dynamics of our models
in a totally different way than just like writing symbols on the page.
Right,
But
and
we also might have like a complete intensive description of some models, in the sense that like suppose you have some system and we can exactly write down its equations of motion.
Right.
But these things are also going to exhibit properties that are emergent in some way that just might not be apparent in the notation.
Right.
You can
In the simulation.
the things that aren't exposed that way.
This already happens in numerical simulation, like when you plot the solutions that you couldn't have obtained with like analytics or even asymptotics, but you just see all at once the solution. there's like a visual intuition that comes from seeing that I think extends to this.
Right.
Like this is like an extended version of that. Like not only would it be like an animation, animations are even crazier, right? Like when you have a time dependent solution to like a PDE, for example, and you like see the time dependent evolution, maybe some like soliton or crazy like, you know, nonlinear phenomenon, you just see it animated, you get that intuition. But if this, in this VR environment, it's like real time like pump probe type thing, where you're able to perturb the system and see how perturbations evolve. You could like grow your intuition by like just poking it, which is what babies do to like figure out, you know, Newtonian mechanics or whatever. They just like jiggle their arms around in crazy ways and then like correlate that with what they see.
Exactly.
You know?
And that happens constantly. And like, especially infants are so much more neuroplastic than adults, but we're still able to see these effects if given enough time in adults. The interesting part is like, we're then going to get into a situation where we're then like, quote unquote, experiencing systems that lie totally outside our normal like spatial intuition or like interactional intuition in a lot of ways. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the body receives these these dynamics that are so outside of like the normal macroscopic material world that we're normally focusing on. But these simulations can be of like astronomical events, or they could be of something at our scale that they're not confined to like the microscopic or the fundamental. And I think that just basically the fact that VR allows you to, in a sense, construct any arbitrary spatial arrangement is just an incredible thing. I'm especially interested in like tools for calculation or tools for understanding. Like you brought it back to the notation, and I think that like a lot of notation that exists now is still stuck in like paper land in a lot of ways, and that's like it's good. It was constructed in the time where paper was the only medium available, and so like these symbols are incredible that we can write them down and understand meaning from them and be able to like arrange them and all those things. But they're only as good as paper is, which is a medium where they can become static and be present for you for as long as you wish to survey them. But there are mediums that we have now, like screens that allow motion to be depicted, and VR, I think, is even the next level, where you're not just getting like a two-dimensional representation of it. You're actually able to move around it in 3D space and perturb it and be able to receive data from it in a way that's not like a limited visual depiction of it. It's something that's totally unstructured, or I think it definitely has to be structured, but it's not structured in any of the same ways that our normal systems are dealt with.
Do you know about tensor networks?
I've heard those words.
It was like an attempt to like depict really nasty like index shuffling and like ridiculous algebraic expressions through like this visual language where it's like boxes with like
This is what we were
wires.
talking about last night. It's like Roger Penrose's.
Oh yes, yeah. We were totally
So
talking
this
about
guy
that.
Jacob Diamante is like a huge like tensor network
Oh, cool.
fiend. He's like there's like tons of like tensor network lectures online by him.
Oh, neat. Yeah, I was commenting to Gray that I don't know of anyone who uses this other than Roger Penrose, but apparently there are people.
Right. So I think that like the cool thing is that it's kind of like, what is the information density in what you write down? So like if you look at Mandarin versus English, or I saw like, I can't find this on the internet anywhere, but like a few years ago I found this blog post that was like an attempt to teach people, like English speakers, a much more condensed like form of notation for reading that was just like it was like 9 by 9 squares, and it was just like sequences of boxes connected together, and these symbols like represented like chunks of letters or like phonemes in the English language, and like composing them like condensed words to like, you know, just blocks of boxes, and it like took you through this tutorial so that like you would learn this language. And it looked like kind of QR codes, but you could like read it like more efficiently than English. But like tensor network states is kind of the same way in math, where writing the corresponding like algebraic expression would like take so much longer and is like so much more clumsy that you don't glean any meaning from it. Whereas like the tensor network like recasts all those algebraic relations in this like visual setup, so you immediately know like what's going on.
And the thing is like we continually find new ways of articulating things when we come up with better representations for these systems, and we see this time and time again when new notations come about. Like like algebra existed before modern algebraic notation existed, but they did it like propositionally. They were writing down these like paragraphs where they were essentially like describing some algebraic relationship, but of essentially graphical elements. But they were describing it in paragraphs using words, and you could still communicate the same truths, but it wasn't present for you in a way that was manipulable. It was just this like big chunk, and you had to write it all out. And it wasn't until Descartes and a few others developed what became modern algebraic notation that it became this tool where everything was modular, and there are these sort of like spatialized manipulations that you could do that you could then internalize as like a rule set and be able to articulate things much faster and kind of like churn through the truths that came about, that became evident, even if like you're just like you're trusting the system because the system works and you're just able to like follow it. And I think that those like differing representations are like so central for us to like try to move past the like any previous method of describing something. And I'm hoping that we don't always just keep on developing new paper notations. And I think that it's worthwhile to try to explore the possibilities of a medium that is dynamic and manipulable and spatialized, because I think that it can provide quite a number of representations and understanding that merely shuffling symbols on paper can't, or maybe much more difficult to do in that sort of thing. Yeah, I think I'll end it there. That's kind of what I was going for.
I think it's super interesting. What's really funny is that tensor network states look like Max MSP.
Really?
It's like it's like boxes connected by wires, and you have to like construct these like black boxes in like circuit diagrams, and it corresponds to like pages and pages of like index shuffling, these like terrible like tensor computations.
I mean, I think it's true that, so when people do topological quantum field theory in the sense that mathematicians do it, you know, they like to write down all of these things like very geometrically, and their relations between various things are just like you know, we talked about the Zorro Z, like you know, algebraically you have to show the associativity of multiplication, but like a single Zorro Z actually does that for you. You just like did it. It's like there's a way in which like having this kind of geometrical language can be way more compact. Or like, you know, people will draw like a pair of pants for like two circles being multiplied together and giving you another circle.
Okay.
Or like a pair of pants the other way for a single circle becoming two circles. That's like the product and co-product in the Bordism category. You know, like you could write that down in terms of symbols, but you could just draw the pair of pants. And, you know, that's the algebraic operation of both product and co-product.
Yeah.
Talking about this?
Right.
Yeah.
It's a fucking good pair of pants. This is a pretty good drawing.
Yeah. Or like when people do like operads, they do like a little disc operad or something like that. You know, they like already.
What the fuck is an operad? I've never gotten that.
I mean,
Globular operad.
I wouldn't even worry about it. You know, like honestly,
It's some like infinity category shit.
I wouldn't worry about it. But the point is that it's some way of systematically writing down like a parametrized family of like infinity categories. Let's say
A parameterized family of infinity categories.
like it itself is an infinity category, but you could also think of it in this way.
Any more infinity categories inside of it.
In a sense, it doesn't matter. The point is like, you know, the linear notation that people use often gets augmented by two-dimensional notation on the paper. And like you think of like the way they draw it is they draw a big disk and they draw a bunch of little disks inside the big disk. And for each configuration of little disks, they have some algebraic object.
Right.
And it's super hard to write down like in a linear way.
But there's a direct correspondence, since you can just write it in this more abstracted view, and then
Yeah, right.
That's sick.
So and you're right. And like people who get really good, they just start thinking in terms of the picture.
Right.
Like, or at least it informs their intuition in a way that they can't even formalize.
But this is actually radical or like novel for our time, or like our generation of mathematicians, because the advent of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, there was like a philosophy that grew out of physics that you shouldn't trust pictures. Like, you know, that there's like this inevitability that we can't possibly construct a picture to describe like the fundamental laws of nature or like deeper math. And so like von Neumann and people like this and Bohr and Dirac were like, heavy proponents of not drawing pictures, and I believe that this bled over into the mathematical community. I'm sure of it. And there was this push towards understanding things algebraically, both on the physics and math side, at least some section of those populations.
You're probably right, and I think there's something to that.
And I think we're coming out of that because people just realize that you can't write down 15-page expressions. It just doesn't, you
Right.
can't, like, that doesn't do anything for you.
And also that like formulae are subject to the same like errors that that pictures are. They're very easy to make.
Right.
Mistakes.
In terms of like typos.
Yeah.
No, I would just sort of like just fucking making mistakes, right? Like it's a lot easier to make mistakes if you don't have some kind of aid to inform your understanding. And also I think that as people are like try to do more and more complicated stuff, or like work with higher and higher levels of abstraction, it becomes more and more apparent that our notation doesn't work as well as we think that it does, and that it's actually very, very often mathematicians write down expressions which notationally are ambiguous. Usually there's not like a single coherent interpretation of what we think a sequence of symbols means, even using the rules that we think that we're applying to understand it, which are not the rules that we're actually applying. We're applying all this like extra background information that we're not aware of that's necessary to parse what a sequence of symbols means. It's a great basically we talk about the Wisdom and Sussman book, Functional Differential Geometry at all, or have any other SMU encountered this book?
You probably mentioned it to me. I don't remember if we talked about it.
So it's like an intro differential geometry book for people who are really into functional programming. And then, like,
Oh,
okay,
hell yeah.